The four horsemen are coming. The four horsemen are coming. The world is going down in flames and you will die a horrible death. That's the typical scenario of most of the past interpretations of the book of Revelation in the verses mentioning these four horsemen and their riders, as depicted in this artwork from an artist's imagination. And somehow all these horrors are tied into the return of Christ, the Messiah, this time of the latter days. This video will present two new interpretations of these verses from Revelation that will tell of, yes, some suffering that would come with the arrival of the Messiah of the latter days, but these interpretations will tell you about what actually happened, past tense, and continue to happen, by the way. Let's start the adventure. Here are three more examples of artists' imaginings of the anticipated gruesome ill effects of the arrival of the four horses with their vengeful riders. Someone has even used some Lego toys to depict these horses and their ominous riders. Kind of cute in a strange sort of way. These two segments of some of the previous artwork shows the bottoms of the pictures. We see the effects upon humanity that the artists foresee from these 8 short verses of the book of Revelation. That is, death, destruction, infernos, your basic devastation. Same with this medieval drawing of the four horsemen and their riders. Of course, the Lego's artwork is much more understated in showing the presumed physical suffering of the people. But is that all that these verses are foretelling? Meaning, is it only physical suffering we should expect from these prophecies? Well, we'll be answering that question in 2 different interpretations of the prophecy of the four horsemen. I'll refer to these 2 interpretations as Interpretation A and Interpretation B. They are as follows. Interpretation A presents the four horses and their riders as 4 major monotheistic faiths on earth. Events during each faith are foretold until, during, and soon after the Messiah appears. Then Interpretation B, that interprets these 4 horses and their riders as 4 forces at work in the world before, during, and for a time after the Messiah returns. Note here to people who have already seen my other 2 separate videos on the four horsemen, part 1 and part 2, I've done away with those 2 separate videos and have put them both on this one video. The actual content has not changed, so if you want to watch it again, that's fine, but just FYI. Also note that both of these interpretations are correct. It's unusual for a prophecy interpretation to say that. Most people who present their understandings of these four horsemen just give one possible interpretation as the correct one. But God's Word in this truly amazing book of Revelation has many meanings that are all correct interpretations. They differ in viewpoint, but there is one particular interpretation all the correct versions must agree upon. That one unchangeable fact in any and all correct interpretations of Revelation is that these interpretations would have to include the fact that the Lamb and the one who sits on the throne, that's the Elijah figure and the Messiah, have already appeared. And yes, that means that all the prophecies in the book of Revelation have already been fulfilled or are in the process of complete fulfillment, including the appearances of the Lamb, or Ram depending on the translation of the Bible, and the Messiah of the latter days, referred to in Revelation as the one who sits on the throne. Now I hope you will continue to watch this entire video to see the evidence for my claims. Also, some of my other videos accessible through my YouTube channel will add to that evidence for this claim. My channel name is Integral Destiny 9. And if you doubt that this could be true, that the Christ has already returned, remember that the Bible says that the Christ, that his return as the Messiah of the latter days, he would return as a thief in the night, sneaking in. No one notices until you wake up in the morning, so to speak. The verses that state that he would return as a thief in the night are listed here. The two asterisked Bible verses at the bottom of the list are from the book of Revelation and are where Jesus himself states to John of Patmos that the Christ to return in the future, the Messiah of the latter days, would come as a thief in the night. The other two verses from 1 Thessalonians and 2 Peter are stated by Peter and Paul, respectively. I'm sorry, I got that reversed. Paul and Peter, respectively. So what I am telling you is that the Messiah has appeared at the time and place foretold in the book of Revelation and in the book of Daniel. He taught for 40 years his new message to humanity. Then he left the scene. But he left you a message, and that message is the Baha'i faith. That is the body of his followers of the new Messiah. His name is Baha'u'llah. There are about 6 million Baha'is spread out all over the world, with about 160,000 of us here in the USA. The two websites you see highlighted in yellow can give you more information about the Baha'i faith. To give you more information about who then fulfilled the divine persons foretold in Revelation, namely the Lamb and the one who sits on the throne, that's in the first column on the far left. The book of Revelation foretells the coming of the Lamb, or Ram in some translations. To the right in the Lamb row, you will see the name of the person who came as the Lamb of Revelation. His name was the Bab, which in English means the gate or door. He was born in 1819 and was martyred, killed, by order of the Persian king in 1850 because of his teachings of the coming of one greater than he, the Messiah. The Bab was the Elijah figure, the forerunner to the yet-to-appear Messiah, the one who sits on the throne. The second row indicates the Revelation also foretells the coming of the person called the one who sits on the throne, who would be the Messiah of the latter days and the return of Christ in the station of the Father. His name was Baha'u'llah. He was born in 1817 and passed away in the Holy Land in 1892. The name Baha'u'llah in English means the glory of God. He was the new Messiah as mentioned. To access my other videos, go to youtube.com, enter this channel name into the YouTube webpage search box. That's Integral Destiny 9, all one word, no spaces, and remember it's a numeral 9 at the end. You may get a listing of several channels with similar names. Select this one, obviously. Then select a video you wish to see from the listing of videos on my channel. These are just 6 of the many videos that are on my YouTube channel that I've done to detail the evidence and proofs that the Messiah of the latter days, Baha'u'llah, has already made his appearance on earth. Now, to learn more about the Bab, the Lamb of the Book of Revelation, there is a recently made movie, about 1 hour long, documentary, that is very good and informative. I think you'll enjoy it. It is a professionally produced video titled The Gate, Dawn of the Baha'i Faith. You can go to Amazon.com to rent or buy it. Here you can see the Amazon.com ad for it. It shows that to rent it, it will cost you about $4, and you may be able to purchase an online access to it starting at $8. Or if you want a DVD, you can purchase the DVD through Amazon too, starting at about $16.50. The DVD gives you some options of languages, but I don't know if the online rental gives you that option or not. Again, the title of it is The Gate, Dawn of the Baha'i Faith. To learn more about Baha'u'llah, him who sits on the throne of the Book of Revelation, Then there is this professionally produced video on YouTube at the address shown on the bottom of the slide. It's about the life of Baha'u'llah and is titled The Prisoner of Akka. It's about 30 minutes in length. It's an interesting account of his exiles and the final exile to the Holy Land on the order of the Persian king and then the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Again, it's on YouTube. It's not on my channel. You'll have to go to Baha'i Vision channel or put the title into the search box on YouTube. There's more information about the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and the Baha'i faith at the end of this video. Now that all that background information is given, we can get on with the show. So we'll be starting with that first of the two interpretations I've labeled as A here, the one circled in red, and that is that the four horsemen symbolize four major monotheistic faiths on earth at and after the time that John of Patmos receives these visions. The four horses, their riders, and the events described for each of them describe the chief characteristics of these four faiths that are the Abrahamic religions until the arrival of the Messiah of the latter days. Much of this explanation of the four horsemen comes from this very informative book by Dr. Alan D. Clark titled Understanding the Revelation to St. John. Unfortunately, I'm sad to report that it is now apparently out of print, but you may be able to find a used copy on the internet or even in a public library somewhere. Good luck if you try to find one. First, you need to understand that the 7 churches mentioned in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation are actually symbolic representations of 7 major monotheistic religions in the world, not 7 Christian churches. If you want the full explanation of this, please watch the video titled 7 Letters to the 7 Churches on my channel of YouTube. I mentioned that video in a previous slide. The Baha'i authoritative texts state this, that the 7 churches are 7 religions. Now these Baha'i texts do not specifically name which church is symbolic of which religion. The author of the book I mentioned, Dr. Alan D. Clark, a Bible scholar, has theorized from his studies that the Church of Ephesus represents the Abrahamic faith. Note that Abraham is a prophet of God. See Genesis chapter 20, verse 7, where that is clearly stated. The Church of Smyrna represents Judaism. The Church of Pergamos or Pergamum, this letter is to the followers of Hinduism. Thyatira, Zoroastrianism. Sardis, the Buddhist faith. Philadelphia, Christianity. And last, Laodicea, this letter is to the future faith of Islam. A note here to those who do not believe that Islam is a religion of God. Please see the video on the book of Revelation and my other video that shows the evidence in several books of the Bible that Muhammad is prophesied as coming as a prophet. That video is titled The Prophet Muhammad Foretold in the Bible, and it's on my channel Integral Destiny 9. Now we're going to talk about the structure and patterns in the book of Revelation. They reveal a lot more information about the future regarding the appearances of the forerunner to the Messiah of the latter days and the Messiah himself. I think you'll find this section more interesting than you might be thinking it would be at this particular moment. This is a grid that shows the chapters and verses of the book of Revelation. The chapters are shown vertically in yellow with chapter 1 at the top and chapter 22 at the bottom. The verses are horizontal, so each white box is a verse in the indicated chapter to the left. There are 3 rows showing the verse numbers. That's in the pink shaded rows. The grayed out boxes towards the right indicate that the chapter has less than 29 verses. Thus, a gray box means there is no such verse in the indicated chapter. Just to make sure you understand the grid, I'll review some examples. The red circle, top left, shows chapter 2. That row indicates that it has 29 verses. If you look on the chapter 2 row all the way to the right, you can see that the red circle on the far right is on the 29th verse box. Again, the verse numbers are in the pink rows at the top, center, and bottom. You can easily see that chapter 15, circled in green on the left, is only 8 verses in length, the shortest chapter in Revelation. Remember, each white box is a verse. In the chapter 15 row, the gray boxes to the right of verse 8 means that this chapter ends with verse 8. Now into this grid, I entered explanations of the content for each chapter and verse or group of verses into the grid, as you can kind of see here. I realize you can't read it, but this shows what was done. When I color-coded these entries according to the subject matter, the pattern of the construction of the book of Revelation was revealed. Note the blue, light dark green, light purple, and dark purple colors of the boxes in particular. I'll be explaining it a bit more so that you'll understand that what I'm telling you is not just plucked out of thin air. From plotting the meanings of the verses by chapter, it was shown that the book of Revelation is a vision story, a prophecy, told in chronological segments that are repeated through several cycles or roundings. With each cycle or rounding, the focus is narrowed down until we arrive at chapter 17. Then 17 through 22, these last 5 chapters of the book, focus on the coming of the new revelation from God, the new city, referred to as the New Jerusalem that comes down from heaven. There's a little hint here. It has nothing to do with the old physical city of Jerusalem. All things made new, you know. To illustrate this cycling or rounding pattern, we will start with chapters 2 through 5, which foretell events in the 7 churches. That's in chapters 2 and 3. Then the coming of the Lamb in chapter 4. That's the Elijah figure to the Messiah to come. And then the Messiah himself in chapter 5. This is the first of the chronological rounding or cycling of events, culminating with the arrival of the Messiah on the far right. For the next round of events, the pattern then changes a bit to exclude the faiths that won't be directly involved in the appearance of the Lamb and the Messiah, including the now extinct, mostly Abrahamic faith, the Hindu faith, Zoroastrianism, and the Buddhist faith. They are not excluded in the remainder of the book because they don't count. That's not at all the case. The Lamb and the Messiah are coming for all humanity, not just a few. It's just that the events and the appearances of the Lamb and the Messiah for the remainder of the prophecy will more directly involve the remaining faiths in the story and the territories they occupy in the Middle East. This leaves us for the next round, where the red arrow is pointing, with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and then again some happenings with the Lamb and then the Messiah. And that second round is in chapter 6, highlighted in light blue in the grid here. This is the second rounding, which reviews chronological events in the prophecy leading up to and including the appearance of the Messiah. This is an enlargement of the chapter 6 summation. Starting from the left, the first seal, that's the little red wax dot, is removed from the scroll. If you remember the scroll that has 7 seals in the book of Revelation, with the removal of the first seal, a white horse with a rider appears. This symbolizes the religion of Judaism. Its background color in the grid here is the darker blue. The second seal is removed and the red horse and rider comes forth, Christianity. The verse is in the lighter blue box. The third seal brings the black horse and rider, symbolizing Islam, the faith brought by Muhammad symbolized in the darker green. Then the fourth seal is removed, and a pale green horse whose rider is Death appears. This symbolizes the corrupted leadership of Islam, corrupted by the first two bad beasts of the book of Revelation. References to this corrupted religion is in light green. Note that the corruption is of the leadership of Islam and not necessarily of the individual practicing Muslim. Then the Lamb appears, that's the lighter purple box, and then the Messiah comes in his glory in the dark purple box. This is the chronology of the second rounding of prophecy events in the book of Revelation. Back to our patterns in Revelation. This is a summary of all 6 rounds of the chronological events. Starting with the top line there, the first round was that one mentioned about the 7 letters in chapters 2 and 3, plus chapter 4 about the Lamb, and the end of the first round is the coming of the Messiah in chapter 5. Now, to make sure you're fully understanding what a rounding is, or a cycle, I'll reiterate, this is a chronology of this first round. It starts with Abraham, then Judaism, then the Hindu faith, then the Zoroastrian faith, then Buddhism, then Christianity, then Islam, then the coming of the Lamb, meaning the Bab, and ends with the coming of the Messiah, that dark purple box in the upper right corner. The second round is in chapter 6. The whole chapter is one round from Judaism through to the coming of the Lamb, then the Messiah that we already reviewed. The third rounding of the story is in chapters 8 through 10. The fourth round drops Judaism and Christianity and only reviews the future coming of Muhammad. Those are the boxes that are the darker green. Then what terrible ramifications of the actions of the 3 bad beasts of Revelation, what they have on Muhammad's faith. That's the light green rectangles. Then matters involving the Lamb, light purple, then the Messiah, dark purple. These are all in chapter 11. The fifth round starts with chapter 12, drops the pure faith of Islam, that's the dark green boxes, and starts with the wounded Islam, that's the light green, after the dastardly doings of the 2 bad beasts have on it. Then it goes into matters dealing with the Lamb. Again, he was the Bab. The round ends again with matters dealing with the Messiah's, the Baha'u'llah's appearance in chapters 15 and 16. Armageddon, by the way, is in chapter 16. The 6th round of the prophecy story drops references to Islam and starts with matters concerning the Lamb in chapter 19. Then most of the remaining chapters, including the end of chapter 19, deal with the revelation of the Messiah, especially his new laws from God and guidance for all humanity for the next 1,000 years, meaning for the 7th millennium. So just where do the 4 horsemen enter the picture? This is an enlargement of the chapter 6 summation. Starting from the left, the first seal, that's the little red wax dot, is removed from the scroll. If you remember the scroll that has 7 seals in the book of Revelation, with the removal of the first seal, a white horse with a rider appears. This symbolizes the religion of Judaism. Its background color in the grid here is the darker blue. The second seal is removed and the red horse and rider comes forth, Christianity. The verse is in the lighter blue box. The third seal brings the black horse and rider, symbolizing Islam, the faith brought by Muhammad, symbolized in the darker green. Then the fourth seal is removed, and a pale green horse whose rider is Death appears. This symbolizes the corrupted leadership of Islam, corrupted by the first 2 bad beasts of the book of Revelation. References to this corrupted religion is in light green. Note that the corruption is of the leadership of Islam and not necessarily of the individual practicing Muslim. Then the Lamb appears, that's the lighter purple box, and then the Messiah comes in his glory in the dark purple box. This is the chronology of the second rounding of prophecy events in the book of Revelation. So the first three horses and riders symbolize these three religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I've developed this table for the review process of the verses about these four horses and their riders. The four horses are in the first column. The verses for each of them are in the second column, and then we'll enter the key points for each of these horses and riders from the verses into that last column. First, I'll read all those verses pertaining to these horses, and then we'll pick out the key points for each of them. Quote, "I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the seven seals. Then I heard one of the four living creatures say in a voice like thunder, 'Come!' I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come!' Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come!' I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine.' When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, 'Come!' I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth." And here are the key points in those verses that will assist us in determining which horse and rider symbolize which religion. I won't go through them all at once, but rather will divide them out and give the interpretation of the meanings for each, starting next. The white horse and its rider are up first. The key points of verses 1 and 2 about the white horse and rider: the rider held a bow, but note that there is no mention of any arrows. The rider was given a crown, but note that it was apparently not a golden crown. This is significant. The horse and rider rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Dr. Clark's conclusion is that this is symbolic of the religion of Judaism. So the first seal on the scroll is broken and a white horse appears. It is the religion of Judaism. Now I'll review how we know this and what the verses tell us about its future, the future of Judaism, from the time of John of Patmos, when he received this vision, until the appearance of the Messiah of the latter days. One of the key points of the verses about the white horse is that its rider held a bow, and there was no mention of any arrows at all in the verse, just that the rider was holding a bow. What good is a bow when you have no arrows? In his book, Dr. Clark stated that the arrow symbolizes, in one way, the zeal of the Jewish people. For example, Elisha the prophet told Joash, the king of Israel, to strike the ground with some arrows. That's in the book of 2 Kings, chapters 13, verse 18. The king did so, but only 3 times, when he was supposed to do it 5 to 6 times. Elisha was not happy with the king's response. Thus the Jews only put in half the effort that they should have. Meaning here that The absence of arrows in this vision of a rider with a bow means, in one sense, that in the future there will be a lack of effort on the part of the Jewish people. But the lack of arrows also has another meaning. For this other meaning, we go back to the book of Isaiah, chapter 49, verses 1 through 4. Now these verses are prophesying the appearance of Jesus, the first advent of the Messiah promised to the Jewish people. The prophesied Messiah is speaking, calling himself I in these verses. Quote, "Listen to me, you islands, hear this, you distant nations. Before I, the Jesus to come, was born, the Lord called me. From his mother's womb he has spoken my name. He made my mouth like a sharpened sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver. He said to me, You are my servant, Israel, in whom I will display my splendor. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing at all. Yet what is due me is in the Lord's hand, and my reward is with my God." So here are the three key indicators or characteristics of the Messiah to come, meaning Jesus, and the Jews' reaction to his appearance. Quote, "My mouth like a sharpened sword. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in his quiver. I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing at all." Mouth like a sword means the Messiah's mouth, meaning his word, his teachings, would wield power and cut down his spiritual enemies. The sword of his tongue, meaning his teachings, would be victorious. This sword is not a weapon of physical combat. The Messiah will not be a warrior killer. His battles will be spiritual in nature. So all these interpretations that anticipate that the Messiah would return, the Christ returned, would come back, kill his oppressors with a literal sword, are completely wrong. Think about it. What we know of the teaching of Jesus about love and forgiveness does not compute at all with this picture of his returning as a warrior and killing people through physical violence. You have to remember here, these verses in Isaiah are about Jesus, but the rider of the white horse in chapter 6 of the book of Revelation also has a sword coming out of his mouth. This is because all the manifestations of God, all the prophets of God, have a sword, meaning the word of God, coming out of their mouths. In Isaiah, the Messiah is described as an arrow concealed in the quiver of God. This is an indication that the identity of the Messiah when he comes would remain hidden from the view of many, meaning most Jews would not recognize him when he first appeared, meaning Jesus the Christ, the first advent of the Messiah. The failure of most Jews to recognize their Messiah the first time around, meaning Jesus, is shown in this white horse having a rider that has a bow but with no arrows. Remember that verse from Isaiah wherein the Messiah describes himself as a polished arrow concealed in God's quiver, concealed to the Jews. But God would give the Jewish people a second chance with the coming of the second advent of the Messiah, described in the book of Revelation later, in chapters 18 through 22. The second key point, the crown, the rider of the white horse was given a crown, but the crown was not mentioned as being a golden crown. That is significant that that was not mentioned as being golden. The crown is symbolic of God establishing the position of kingship in the Jewish faith. This kingship was different from the kings of the idolatrous tribes and religions in the area of the early Hebrews, since the king of Israel was to surrender his will to the will of God. This kingship began under David. After David and Solomon, however, the kings failed in their duty to abide by the will of God. Thus, this may be the reason it is not described as being gold, since non-golden crowns would be tarnished, whereas gold would not, and their crowns were tarnished by the fact that they did not fulfill their duty to abide by the will of God. Another thought, after about 63 BC, the Hebrew nation was conquered and remained under the rule of others until the new Messiah's forerunner, the Bab, made his announcement in 1844 of his appearance, and the Messiah's was to arrive soon after him. In that year, 1844, the Jews attained the legal right to once again live in and have legal protections in the Holy Land. And then 100 years later, in 1948, of course, the nation of Israel was given legal recognition by the UN. We come to the significance of the white color of the horse. A few of the reasons that the color white is associated closely with Judaism include: in Judaism, the color white is equated with spiritual purity and the purification of its followers. The purification process is a key ritual in Judaism. And Moses needed to prove his divine authority to the people. He did this by putting his hand on his chest, and it turned white. But there is another white horse and rider in the book of Revelation, a fifth horse and its rider. We need to clarify that the second white horse and its rider in chapter 19 is not the same white horse and rider as in chapter 6. So let's just read a bit from Revelation chapter 19. That's verses 11 through 14. Quote, I saw heaven standing open, and there before me was a white horse, whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and wages war. His eyes are like blazing fire, and on his head are many crowns. He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself. He is dressed in a robe dipped in blood, and his name is the Word of God. The armies of heaven were following him, riding on white horses and dressed in fine linen, white and clean. That's the end of the quote here. This was just to give you a sample from chapter 19's white horse and rider. The rider of the white horse in chapter 19, near the end of the book of Revelation, is a prophet of God, also known as a manifestation of God. In other words, the Messiah of the latter days to the Jews and the returned Messiah to Christians and Muslims. The new Messiah being prophesied in chapter 19 is the whole basic purpose of this book of Revelation. To be absolutely clear on this point, in all correct interpretations of the book of Revelation, the rider of the white horse in chapter 6, that's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, is not the same as the white horse and rider in chapter 19. The horse and rider in chapter 6 of the four horsemen is not the Messiah to come. The rider of the white horse in chapter 6 is a prophet or manifestation of God, but his name was Moses. This is just an illustration of the previous point that the white horse and rider of chapter 6 is not the same white horse and rider in chapter 19. The riders of the first three horses, the white, the red, and the black horses, are symbolic of prophets or manifestations of God. In the case of these two riders of the white horses, one is from the past, that's Moses in the case of the rider of the white horse in chapter 6. The other from chapter 19 is symbolic of the Messiah to come, meaning a prophet or manifestation of God of the future. Who I'm telling you here was named Baha'u'llah, who lived from 1817 to 1892 in the Middle East. Later I will elaborate a bit about the chapter 19 white horse and rider, who is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Baha'u'llah. But we have to get back on task now. We're talking about that first white horse, the white horse and rider of chapter 6 of the four horsemen of the apocalypse fame. This white horse and rider rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Note that it states that they went out bent on conquest. They may have intended to conquer, but were they, the horse and rider, successful at conquering? A question here. How well can you conquer when you only have a bow but no arrows? The Jews were commanded by God to conquer their neighbors, the idolaters. Here from Joshua chapter 23, verse 4, Joshua is speaking to the Israelites. Quote, "Remember how I have allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the land of the nations that remain, the nations I conquered between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea in the west." End quote. Joshua did this conquering of the promised land that Moses led them to, having been given assurances that God commanded it and would ensure their success under Joshua's leadership. But Joshua, when he was very old and near the end of his life, goes on to warn the Israelites in verses 12 and 13 of the same chapter, quote, "But if you turn away and ally yourselves with the survivors of these nations that remain among you, and if you intermarry with them and associate with them, then you may be sure that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you. Instead, they will become snares and traps for you, whips on your backs and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land, which the Lord your God has given you." End quote. God did not want the Jews to mix with other tribes because of the influence of their idol worship. The conquering of these tribes was to establish the Jews in the whole promised land and to eliminate the influence of idolatry. Throughout many centuries since the time of Joshua, the Jews often did mix with neighboring tribes, with the results of idol worship being introduced. Periodically, the kings of Israel and Judea would follow Mosaic law, others would be corrupted and regress to idolatry. The Jews established a united kingdom until after the death of King Solomon around the year 931 BC. It then split into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south, or Judea, as you see here on the map. Through the centuries, the kings of Israel and Judah either did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, or the opposite, did evil in the eyes of the Lord, per quotes from various Bible verses. Those kings who did right meant they followed and had their kingdoms follow the laws of God. Those kings who were deemed evil turned their backs on Mosaic laws, often meaning they reverted to idol worship. So through time, the Jewish people, especially kings, were not consistent in their abiding by the laws of God, that half-hearted effort mentioned before. But John of Patmos was receiving a vision about the future to him. So what of Judaism after about 95 AD, also known as 95 CE, that's for Common Era, when John received his vision and wrote it down as the book of Revelation? So the half-heartedness of the Jewish people in their obedience to God, shown by the lack of arrows, continued as the Jews missed the first coming of the Messiah. Chapter 6, verses 1 and 2 addresses the condition of the Jews at the time of the second coming of the Messiah of the latter days. So then this prophecy would have been about the efforts of the Jewish people after the time of Jesus. Within 50 years or so of the crucifixion of Jesus, the temple was demolished. Within about 140 years or so after the time of Jesus, the Jews rebelled against Rome, resulting in their defeat and the diaspora of the Jews out of their beloved Holy Land, which lasted until about the coming of the forerunner of the Messiah of the latter days, by the way. So if we go back to that verse from chapter 6, verse 2, quote, "rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest," note that they may have intended to conquest, such as the rebellions against Rome, but they failed, resulting in their own defeat and being dispersed throughout the world out of the Holy Land. The verses in Revelation do not say they were conquerors, just they wanted to conquer. I think we can agree that this white horse and rider of chapter 6 is very likely to symbolize the faith of Judaism. Then came the red horse and its rider with the opening of the second seal on the scroll. Let's go back to review the Revelation verses 3 and 4 of chapter 6 about this red horse and rider. Quote, "When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come.' Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword." End quote. The key points of these verses about the red horse and rider are that the rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other, and the rider was given a large sword. Just as the prophet Moses and his teachings were the rider of the white horse, this second horse that showed up, the red horse, was ridden by the prophet Jesus the Christ. The red horse symbolizes the religion that resulted from his teachings and the body of his followers. If you reject Jesus being called a prophet, remember what Moses said about Jesus in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15, quote, "The Lord your God will raise up for you, Israel, a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him." End quote. So Moses referred to Jesus as a prophet. I'll take Moses' word for it. What is the symbolic significance of the color of this horse, red? Well, red in Bible prophecy is used to mean three possible meanings, all of which could apply here. And that would be sacrifice, war, and/or blood. Now you are probably thinking, but Jesus taught about love thy neighbor and even to love your enemy. How could you think this rider is Jesus? Well, if you turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 10, verse 34, and Jesus is speaking here, quote, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword." End quote. So Jesus himself said that he was not going to bring peace to the world, but rather the opposite, a sword, meaning violence. Even the book of Luke, chapter 12, verse 51, records this remark by Jesus as follows, quote, "Do you think I, Jesus, came to bring peace on earth? No, I tell you, but division." End quote. And what does division often result in? Estrangement, violence, and then even worse, war and bloodshed. And here's some evidence that Jesus was absolutely correct about the dissension and violence that his appearing on earth was the impetus for, by his followers not following all of Jesus's teachings about loving your neighbor and your enemies. For instance, the expansion of the Byzantine Empire by conquest. Christianity was the state religion of the Byzantine Empire after 380 Common Era. The empire's territory was greatly expanded under Emperor Justinian I, who reigned from 527 to 565 Common Era. This expansion was through military conquest. This is a map of Europe, the Near East, and Northern Africa. The area shaded in dark green is the territory ruled by the Byzantine Empire at the time of the ascension of Justinian I as its emperor. And this map shows the largest extent of the Byzantine Empire under Justinian I, here as it was in the year 555 Common Era. The Byzantine Empire shrank from this state to a very small area around Constantinople until the year 1485 Common Era, when the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople and renamed it Istanbul. Some further examples of dissension and violence involving Christians. Well, we have the Crusades against Muslims from about 1095 through 1291 Common Era. And of course the various inquisitions within Christianity itself in many parts of the world, not just the Spanish Inquisition, up through the mid-1860s. And let us not forget the support for human slavery in supposedly Christian nations. Some Christians excused that, some still do, because the people who were enslaved did not look like them or believe in the same faith as they did, so that they could use the excuse that these other beings were not equally human, therefore worthy of being enslaved. Science proves to us now that all humans of all colors throughout the world are brothers and sisters, all equally human. Slavery is violence towards the people who were enslaved. Note that the new Messiah, Baha'u'llah, has prohibited slavery in this new era of humankind. So a whole lot of war and bloodshed has happened since the time of Jesus Christ, much due to his followers, just as Jesus foretold. We can see that the characteristics of this red horse and rider bear close resemblance to the Christian world since the time of Jesus, lending weight to the argument that this red horse and rider do indeed symbolize Jesus and his body of followers. Now, not all the violence in the world was due to Christians, but Christians did play a part in that. But let's go back to the symbolism of the red color of the horse. We didn't really address the red color as the color of sacrifice. Obviously, Jesus was the personification of sacrifice when he appeared amongst humankind, knowing that he would likely lose his life because of the religious and political waves his new teachings caused. He willingly gave his life to give impetus to his followers to teach his faith throughout the world. And the last verse regarding the red horse and rider is that the rider was given a large sword. Note that the blood pictured on the sword in this picture is not in the Bible verse. It's really quite amazing how people have embellished the actual descriptions in the Bible in their artwork of the four horsemen. This artist added blood on the sword when there was no mention of it in the Bible text. Now, the word sword has at least two meanings. The first meaning of the word sword in Bible prophecy is the obvious one, a weapon used to kill and maim, mostly other human beings, innocent or not. In prophecy, if the prophecy is to be fulfilled in our modern times, sword could also stand for other weapons such as guns, bombs, including atomic bombs, missiles, anything that can do harm. But the second meaning, and I think a far more important meaning, is that the sword symbolizes the Word, the teachings of the prophet or manifestation of God, who God sends to give us humans a new revelation of spiritual teachings for our times, the times or era that the prophet was sent to spiritually transform. In this case, the rider of the red horse symbolizes Jesus Christ as the manifestation of God for that era, the first advent of the Jewish Messiah. The sword symbolizes his teachings, which have been recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the other books of the New Testament. You might be asking what this meaning is based upon. Where does it come from? Am I just inventing this meaning for swords in the Bible verses? In the New Testament, a new meaning for the word sword was introduced. If we look at the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 12, quote, "For the word of God is alive and active, sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow. It judges the thoughts and attitudes of the heart." End quote. To emphasize, this verse says that the Word of God is sharper than any double-edged sword. The Word of God, the teachings of God, are equated with a sword. Then in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 17, this quote, "Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God." End quote. To repeat, the sword of the Spirit is the Word of God. Here the meaning is that the Word of God is the protection of humanity, like a helmet and a sword, not that the followers of God should use actual swords to be their spiritual salvation. Then we get to that book of prophecy of the future, the prophecies brought by John of Patmos by Jesus, speaking here of his return in the future in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, verse 16, quote, "Repent, therefore, otherwise I will come to you and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth." End quote. Thus, again, Bible verses tell us that a sword symbolizes the Word of God, and the way we get knowledge of the Word of God is through His messengers that He sends to us, the manifestations of God, also known as the prophets of God. So the evidence shows us that this interpretation of the meaning of the red horse and rider indicates that the red horse and rider are truly symbolizing Jesus and his followers, his church. The horse as his church, with the rider symbolizing the manifestation of God that God sent to humanity after Moses and his white steed of Judaism. That's the first horse and rider. Then when the third seal was broken on the scroll in verse 5, a black horse and rider appear. And here are verses 5 and 6 again, quote, "When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come.' I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." End quote. To highlight the key points of these verses, the rider is holding a set of scales, also known as a balance. A voice announces 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages. The voice also commands them not to damage the oil and the wine. The color of this horse, black, has significance, as do the colors of the other horses. So, what religion do you think is symbolized as the black horse with its prophet upon its back? Islam, of course. One reason is that the next faith has to be a religion that appeared on the world scene after the time of Jesus. Next, we'll go through the clues that shows the truth of that. Now, if you are seeing red at the idea that Muhammad is a real prophet of God, see the video titled "The Prophet Muhammad Foretold in the Bible." This video reviews how Muhammad is mentioned in several places in the Bible as a prophet to come, although he's not the Jewish or Christian Messiah, by the way. Go to YouTube at youtube.com and enter into the search box in the YouTube webpage the following channel name, all one word with no spaces between, Integral Destiny 9, and don't forget the number 9 at the end. Then select this video from several you will find listed. The rider of the black horse is Muhammad, the prophet who established Islam, which is symbolized by the black horse. Now, a little caution here. This artist, whoever he or she was, came up with the rider being mostly unclothed and almost a skeleton in appearance. There is nothing in the verses about the rider on the black horse that describes the rider itself. So the appearance of this rider in the artwork is purely from the imagination of the artist, not based on the verses. The artist may have been interpreting this horse and rider as bringing hard times, which include famine. Thus thought the rider would have insufficient food, so would be kind of a skeleton. One of the key characteristics is that the rider of the black horse is given a pair of scales, or a balance. What in the world could that mean? Well, Muhammad was a merchant, and merchants of the time used scales to determine the price or value of certain amounts of commodities that they sold or traded, and the amount of gold to change for those commodities. Scales are the means of determining the value of something. But for a prophet of God, they have a different meaning. So having Muhammad carry these scales is symbolic of his divine teachings from God as being a test of the spiritual condition of his followers, individually and as a whole. Dr. Clark mentioned that the scales may be a symbol of the revelation of Muhammad as, quote, "the balance by which the true value of the human soul would be judged," end quote. The Quran, the book that Muhammad brought, also uses this interpretation of scales in that way. The quality of the individual soul is assayed by God. The soul's qualities for good or bad are weighed by God. Here are 3 examples of how the Quran speaks of God's weighing or assaying the spiritual condition of humankind. The use of a balance or scale is mentioned in all 3 of these examples. Quote, "And the weighing on that day, the day of resurrection, will be the true weighing, so as for those whose scale of good deeds will be heavy, they will be successful by entering paradise, end quote. That's chapter or Surah 7, verse 8. Next, quote, and give full measure when you measure, and weigh with a balance that is straight, that is good or advantageous and better in the end, end quote. That's from chapter or Surah 17, verse 35. And the third example is, quote, and we shall set up balances of justice on the day of resurrection, then none will be dealt with unjustly in anything. And if there be the weight of a mustard seed, we will bring it, and sufficient are we to take account. End quote. Chapter 21, verse 47. By the way, in this last quote, it is a prophecy of the future of how God will judge humankind upon the day of resurrection, which is the coming of the next prophet of God. Note that many Muslims use just one of other verses in the Quran to pose that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. They deduce that to mean the last prophet of God. Their interpretation of that verse is incorrect. This verse on the slide is one of the many references in the Quran to the coming of the day of resurrection, or the coming of clear evidence, among others, that speak of another prophet of God coming. In this verse, God is saying that at the time of that future prophet coming, he will bring people to account for their good deeds and their bad. The Bab and Baha'u'llah are the prophets of which Muhammad spoke as coming. Now back to the book of Revelation about the black horse and rider, to the verse wherein it was, quote, heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures, saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, end quote. Regarding the voice from amongst the four living creatures, these four living creatures are those that are described in Revelation chapter 4, verses 6 to 9 as praising God and circling around his throne in John's vision. These four living creatures are servants of God and do his bidding. Thus, this voice coming from among them is speaking God's instructions regarding the black horse and rider. Just to clarify some terms here, different translations of the Bible in the New Testament give different types or denominations of payments for the work performed. They also give different terms for the amount of the 2 grains mentioned in verse 6. In the New International Version translation, the payments to the workers is given as a day's wages. In the King James Version, it's given as a penny. The New King James Version, retranslated in 1976, that penny was changed to a denarius. Denarius is the term actually used in the Greek. The American Standard Version calls the payment a shilling. Seems kind of strange that the so-called American version would use a British coinage term. The difference between a penny for a day's wage and the shilling might originate in the value of a day's work, having increased from a penny to a shilling by the time of the King James Version to the writing of the American Standard Version in 1881, 270 years later. Why this difference in the payment to the workers in various Bible translations? Let's go back to the Greek text of the Revelation chapter 6, verse 6. This is the Greek text of this verse about the black horse and rider. The yellow highlighted words translate as denarius, a coin of the realm at the time similar to the coin that's pictured here. So, if the Greek text actually specifies that a denarius coin was given for the amounts of wheat and barley, why is it referred to in some translations as a day's wage? We have to go back to the book of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 and 2 for the source of that, quote, and this is Jesus speaking this parable. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay them a denarius for the day and sent them into his vineyard, end quote. In this verse, Jesus speaks of a daily wage of some workers in the vineyard as being 1 denarius, thus kind of setting the standard others have used for other such references to a daily wage at the time of Jesus as being 1 denarius. The verse in Greek gives the more modern Greek scene here. It appears fairly certain that the type of grains mentioned in the verse are, as depicted here, wheat and barley. By the way, we will discuss the amounts of the grain that are given in exchange for a denarius when we get to the second interpretation of Revelation later. The amount of grain is not really relevant in this interpretation of the four horsemen. The more modern and more correct translations of Revelation tend to state that a denarius could have been a typical daily wage of a laborer at the time of Jesus. This idea of a day's wage thus became a symbolic reference in prophecy in the book of Revelation. Christians would know of the teaching in the parable about the workers in the vineyard once they saw a reference in Revelation to a denarius for a day's wage. So the Greek text references to a denarius being given is a hidden way of speaking of a daily wage. What is the meaning of the reference to the daily allotments of grain? Grains are used to make bread and other food for sustenance of the physical body. The concept of bread is also used symbolically by Jesus as a meaning bread from heaven, which sustains one's soul. The book of Revelation contains many visions that use a heavenly language of symbolism and illusions. That's allusions with an A, not illusion with an I. This bread that Jesus mostly speaks about are the spiritual messages of his dispensation, when he came to teach us about God's laws for their time and into the future to nurture and sustain our souls. In these two verses of John chapter 6, verses 32 and 33, Jesus is speaking here, quote, Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." End quote. Note that I've added some special emphasis there. So Jesus directly said that his concerns about the bread from heaven is that he, Jesus, is giving them what the true bread from heaven is, that is spiritual food, not at all the bread of heaven that Moses provided, which is understood to be physical manna from heaven, probably meaning from the sky, not the spiritual heaven of which Jesus speaks of here. Note that coming from heaven is most often quite different from coming from the sky in biblical terminology. That last verse, the bread of God is the bread that gives life to the world, obviously means that guidance and laws from God provided through his manifestation or prophet is what provides spiritual nutrition to humankind's souls. Then there's this from the same chapter of John, verse 35, quote, "Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." End quote. Obviously, this is not to be taken literally. Jesus is not advocating cannibalism. Jesus is using his body and bread as symbols for spiritual nutrition, illustrating our finding spiritual nourishment by making the laws and teachings that Jesus brought from a God a part of ourselves, to take them into our lives and make them an integral part of our souls. Muhammad provided the Quran for the spiritual nutrition of his followers. Symbolically, this pictured bread is a quotation from the Quran, nutrition for the soul. This particular quote from the Quran says, quote, "Say, if ye do love God, follow me. God will love you and forgive you your sins, for God is oft forgiving, most merciful." End quote. This quote is from Surah or chapter 3, verse 31. So, having your daily bread is about having a daily feeding on spiritual manna from heaven, and that is through prayer and the reading of God's Word. In Islam, that is the holy book, the Quran. So daily bread is prayer and recitation of holy words. So what does this talk of bread and a day's wages have to do with Islam? Well, Muhammad brought a law that required the saying of prayers 5 times a day by his followers, the Muslims. Through Muhammad, the angel Gabriel provided the Quran as the bread Muslims could feast upon. The saying of prayers 5 times a day is a distinctive feature of Islam. The next key point, showing how the black horse and rider symbolize Islam and the Prophet Muhammad, respectively, is that the voice announcing this horse also commands to not damage the oil and the wine. Oil is symbolic of Judaism and the Jewish people. This is obvious if we realize that oil was used in the purification of the altar in Jewish worship. Oil was also used in the ritual anointing of their kings, and olive oil was used to fuel their lamps. And in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 11, verse 16, God refers to the Jews as an olive tree. Quote, "The Lord once called you a green olive tree, fair with goodly fruit." End quote. And wine is symbolic for Christianity and Christians. This symbolism can be understood since wine was used in the sacraments in Christian worship as a sign of the covenant. Also, Jesus used the metaphor of his bringing new wine, that is, his new revelation and teachings, which could not be put into old wineskins. Remember that from Matthew chapter 9, verse 17. Thus, the phrase, "do not damage the oil and the wine," therefore foretells Muhammad's teaching that his followers not hurt people of the book, meaning a directive to not harm Jews and Christians. We have answered how the black horse and rider brought the requirement for daily bread, but we have one remaining attribute that needs to be tied into Islam, and that is the color black. The land of Arabia, where Muhammad was born and established his faith, Islam, is home to the Bedouin tribes who are renowned for their black tents. Arabia is also known for volcanic activity, known to geologists, that is. Most people in the West are completely unaware of it. Lava fields are called Hara, that's singular. More than one Hara is called a Harat, that's plural. Arabia has one of the planet's largest alkali basalt regions, which is about 180,000 square kilometers, or 70,000 square miles. This map shows the lava fields, the Harat, in light green. The city of Medina, in the western area of Arabia, was the location where Muhammad's faith, Islam, first took root and blossomed. Note that it is spelled differently on this map, Madinah. Medina is located at the northern edge of the Medina Hara, shaded in dark green, and is part of the Harat lava fields. Those are the light green areas. This photo shows a farm, a highway, and business centers cut into edges of a Hara. That's the dark lava field near Medina. While in the year 1256 the molten lava encroached upon the city, today it's the city that's beginning to flow over parts of the Hara. This is a quote taken from an article titled "Volcanic Arabia" by author Peter Harrigan. It appears on pages 2 to 13 of the March and April 2006 print edition of Saudi Aramco World at the website given on the screen. The map on the previous slide is also from this article. So Muhammad and his faith, Islam, originated from the black earth of Arabia. To this point, I've shown evidence that the first 3 horses and horsemen are very closely related to the faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. What then of the 4th horseman of the apocalypse at the bottom of this table? Ah, at last we are at the 4th horseman of the apocalypse, the pale horse and rider. And to remind ourselves of what the verses said about this 4th horse and rider, here are those verses again. Quote, When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. End quote. The key points from these verses: the rider is named Death. Hades is mentioned as following close behind. This horse and rider is given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by the sword, famine, plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. The color of the horse, pale green. Where'd that green come from? I'll explain that next. The previous faiths were all partially identified and symbolized by a color, white, red, and black, but the fourth horse and rider are stated as being pale. What color is pale? From the Merriam-Webster dictionary, here are 4 possible definitions of the adjective pale. Note that more than one of or all of these definitions could be applicable here. First, deficient in color or intensity of color, pallid, such as pale complexion, not bright or brilliant, dim, for example, the pale light of dawn, feeble or faint, meaning a pale imitation, not the real thing. Deficient in chroma, again, color intensity is deficient, such as a pale pink. Some newer translations of the Bible, of these verses, have improved our understanding of what the language or the original Greek was saying. And for instance, the color of the horse by many is now deemed to be pale green instead of just pale. And this particular translation, New Living Bible translation, gives, instead of Hades following death, it's the grave following death. And as I mentioned, there are other translations now that also state pale green, including that New Living Bible translation, number 1 here, that now states the color of this horse as being green or pale green, are the others you see here listed 2 through 6. So we're not talking about just one translation now saying that the actual translation of the term here indicates this horse is pale green or green and not just pale. What then of a pale green horse? First of all, there are no green horses in nature. Therefore, this underscores or emphasizes the point that a green horse is symbolic of something else. This unnatural pale green horse is symbolic of an ungodly or corrupted faith, and the rider, those who corrupted it. This fourth horse, this corrupted faith, would happen after the advent of Muhammad. That's the black horse and rider, and before the return of Christ. That's the fifth horse and rider that occurs in chapter 19 that we've mentioned before. This is a graphic to get this point across. The pink arrow is pointing to the pale green horse and rider on this timeline to show that it comes after the black horse and rider, symbolic of the faith of Muhammad, Islam. Note that the fifth horse and rider from chapter 19 of Revelation is further down the timeline and time to the right. So, what religion is it that was corrupted to such a degree as to be depicted as a sickly, unnatural version of another faith, to deserve that unnatural pale green color? It is a corrupted version of Islam. But it's not the divinely revealed faith brought by Muhammad, but rather a pale, sickly version of it. This pale green corrupted faith is what happened to the pure teachings of Islam by the actions of the beast of Revelation, the first beast described as the red dragon in chapter 9 verse 11, in chapter 11 verse 7, and in chapter 12, verse 3, the red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns. All these verses describe the same beast that wounded the true Islam and prevented the complete fulfillment of its splendor. This illustration is an artist's rendition of chapter 12, wherein John has a vision of a woman clothed in the sun with the moon at her feet. She is about to give birth. The woman is symbolic of Muhammad's pure revelation from God, Islam. Her being clothed in the sun with the moon at her feet symbolizes the 2 major sects of Islam and the countries in which these 2 sects were primarily followed in the 2 countries that the Messiah would appear in. The sun for the Shia branch, found primarily in Persia. Note that one of the symbols of Persia or Iran is the sun. And the moon at her feet is a symbol of the Ottoman Empire, which was primarily Sunni. The dragon symbolizes the corruption of the leadership of Islam by first the Umayyad clan's confiscation of the leadership of Islam when Muawiyah became the 5th caliph, quite possibly by trickery and murder, and established the Umayyads, his clan, in power for the next 150 years. After the Umayyads, the Abbasid clan, who murdered the Umayyad leaders and took their power and positions, continued this corruption. This was true down through the years even to the Ottoman Empire, which ended in the early 1900s, and the Caliphate of the Sunni sect of Islam also ended. Note that corrupt leadership of any organization, even a religion, has a negative effect on the whole, especially on how people on the outside view it when they know the leadership is corrupt. It needs to be strongly emphasized here that I'm not speaking of all followers of Islam as being corrupted. That's not the case at all. It's the corruption of the leadership of Islam by these power and wealth-hungry groups. But they did not completely obliterate the true teachings of Muhammad and the Quran. The spiritual truth was kept by many ordinary Muslims who were and are not part of the corrupted leadership. Muhammad's holy book, the Quran, has not been corrupted. It should be noted briefly here that the text of the Quran is intact, although some interpretations of some parts of the text were skewed by the usurpers of the correct leadership. Some of the hadith are the traditional sayings of Muhammad that were later written down by many people after Muhammad's death. Again, some of the hadith were falsified by some corrupt leaders to suit their material needs, not the spiritual needs of the Muslim community. A little more about how the leadership of Islam was corrupted. Note that Muhammad was a true prophet of God foretold in the Bible, such as in the book of Genesis, chapter 17, Deuteronomy, chapter 33, Daniel, chapters 2, 4, and 7, the book of Revelation, chapters 11 and 12, and others. Muhammad's strong teachings against idolatry resulted in his having many wealthy and powerful enemies who raised armies to fight Muhammad and his believers. Muhammad's teachings endangered their wealth obtained from idol-worshipping pilgrims who came to Mecca and spent a lot of money. Muhammad's enemies tried to kill him. When that failed, Muhammad fled to Medina, where he found not only refuge but many converts to Islam. Muhammad's enemies continued to try to quash the spread of the monotheistic Islam that put their wealth-producing idol worship in Mecca in jeopardy. His enemies included many merchants in Mecca. The emir of Mecca, that's a king or governor, named Abu Sufyan, and his son Muawiyah were 2 of the people who vowed to kill Muhammad to end his faith. There were even some Jewish tribes who fought against Muhammad and the Muslims. When the Quran makes mention of these Jewish enemies, harsh wording is used, but it only speaks to these Jewish tribes that directly fought Muhammad and his followers. those condemnations of Jews does not apply to all Jews, since elsewhere in the Quran, Muhammad specifically states that his followers are not to force Islam on people of the book, which includes Jews and Christians. When Muhammad and his forces won battles against these murderous Meccans, many of these enemies surrendered and joined Muhammad. But a few went underground within the Muslim faith, and through subterfuge and even murder, they took over Islam after Muhammad's death. His death occurred in 632 Common Era. Now, it was Muawiyah, son of Abu Sufyan, who was the emir of Mecca, who was the principal corrupter. He was the one full of ambition and murderous things. He was, you might even think of him as being the Antichrist of the Islamic dispensation. Now, if Muawiyah and the Umayyads, and Muawiyah was a member of the Umayyad clan, if they were the usurpers and corrupt, who were the correct leaders of Islam that Muhammad wanted? From the very beginning of Muhammad's revelation, his young cousin Ali was his assistant and one of the first to believe in Muhammad's prophethood. Ali's role was similar to the role of Joshua to Moses, as a supporter, promulgator, and defender of Islam, just as Joshua served Moses. Muhammad had several times verbally stated that he wanted Ali to be the leader, his successor of Islam upon his death. This was not written down, however. After Muhammad's death, the tribal leaders bypassed Ali. Instead, they chose Abu Bakr to be the first caliph of Islam, thus denying Ali his rightful position as head of the faith of Islam. The word caliph means successor. The initial caliphs were, the first one, Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman. After the third caliph, Uthman, died in 656 Common Era, he was assassinated because he was so unpopular, the leaders of Islam were compelled by popular demand to name Ali as the next caliph. At last. He served from 656 until he was murdered in 661 Common Era. It was strongly suspected that Muawiyah, you remember him, had ordered that Ali be killed. Muawiyah thought that he should be caliph instead of Ali because Uthman had been from the Umayyad clan, as was Muawiyah. So Muawiyah believed that the caliphate successor should also be an Umayyad, such as himself. Remember that Muawiyah and his father Abu Sufyan only became Muslims after their forces from Mecca were defeated by Muhammad's army. Both he and his father never really became devoted to Muhammad, quite the opposite. They, Muawiyah and Abu Sufyan, desired only position, power, and wealth, not the spiritual rewards of this or the next world. Ali's son Hassan was named caliph to succeed his father, but he resigned about 6 months later and retired to a life of piety and study. Many attribute this sudden retirement as resulting from threats of harm from Muawiyah. Oddly enough, Muawiyah succeeded Hassan as caliph. He finally finagled himself into being caliph, and the final step of the usurpation of Muhammad's designated leadership of successorship occurs. I'll refer to Muawiyah as the fifth caliph because Hassan held the position so briefly, and Hassan is even neglected by many historians as having ever been caliph. Muawiyah was the first of many Umayyad caliphs. He started the dynasty of the Umayyad clan caliphs. He and most of his successors were treacherous and power-seeking, not at all spiritual in viewpoint like Ali and his sons were. This slide illustrates how the two principal sects of Islam, Sunni and Shia, developed. Here you can see that the caliphate began after Muhammad's death. That's on the left. And note that the fourth caliph, being Ali, he was not only the caliph to the new Sunni sect of Islam, but basically upon his murder he was also considered to have been the first imam of the Shia sect of Islam, shown in the purple boxes to the right. There were many people who never really accepted the naming of Abu Bakr as the first caliph and the others as leader of Islam because that was contrary to the known wishes of Muhammad. They considered Ali and his male offspring as the only rightful successors to Muhammad. Thus the split between the Sunni and Shia sects began. The takeover of the leadership of Islam by duplicitous, murderous thugs, the Umayyad clan, tarnished the outward appearance of Islam and subverted its achievement of a glorious kingdom of God on earth. Thus the resultant pale version of true Islam, the sickly green caliphate of the Umayyads, the Abbasids after them, and others after them, came about. The 12 Imams of Shia Islam were descendants of Ali, as Muhammad wanted. The 12th Imam was either killed or otherwise disappeared, an apparent mystery. This occurred in the year 260 AH, that's year 874, Common Era of the Gregorian calendar. The Islamic prophecy is that the 12th Imam would return in the year 60, meaning Islamic calendar year 1260, and would redeem mankind. So far, I've just mentioned that Sunni Islam has suffered by pale, sickly leadership. However, Shia Islam has not been immune from many of the same problems. With the removal of the guidance of the Ali lineage leaders of Shia Islam in 874 Common Era, Shia Islam suffers from lack of divinely inspired leadership since that time. In the more than 1,000 Islamic years since the 12th Imam disappeared and Ali's lineage as head of the Shia Islam sect ended, Shia Islam has also become sickly and pale in comparison to when the true successors to Muhammad were guiding the faith. Fully abiding by the covenant of God matters. Remember, it's primarily the leadership that is sickly and pale. Of course, leadership ultimately decides a lot of the focus and direction of any organization, including a faith. The average individual Muslim who tries to abide by the true spirit of Muhammad's teachings and does not follow the sickly understandings of the Quran or the corruption of the leadership may not be directly affected by this corruption as individual believers, although materially they may be affected because of the worldly decisions by leaders of the faith. There is a prophecy in Shia Islam that the 12th Imam, that's the one that disappeared before, will return in the year 60, that's 1260 of the Islamic calendar, as the Mahdi. And that year is the same year as 1844 Common Era in the West. In that year, 1844, the Bab proclaimed in Shiraz, Persia, ancient Elam of the Bible, that he was this expected Mahdi and the forerunner to the coming Messiah of the latter days. And just to illustrate all this in our story of the four horsemen, we now see that corrupted Islam is the fourth horse whose rider is death. Remember that this corrupted faith comes after the advent of Muhammad, symbolized by the third horse, color black, and the rider, and before the return of Christ, the fifth horse and rider that occurs in chapter 19, verses 11 through 16 of the book of Revelation. Now we continue our discussion of the key points for this pale green horse and its rider. The rider is named Death, with Hades following close behind. And this horse and rider have been given power over a quarter of the earth to kill by sword, famine, plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Now the rider named Death. The rider is corrupt leadership. Muawiyah is the personification of the rider as the chief destroyer of the faith of Islam. Also, Muawiyah personifies that red dragon. death illustrates the dead and lifeless spiritual content of this corrupted faith due to the Antichrist having taken control of it, symbolized by the pale green unnatural color. Hades means hell, but Hades also means the unseen. The use of the term and symbol of death is not about death in the physical world, but rather spiritual death and lifelessness. Hades is symbolic of the absence of divine authority, protections, and direction. Then there's this key point. The horse and rider were given power over a quarter of the earth to kill by sword, famine, plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Regarding that key phrase about this horse and rider being given power over a quarter of the earth, note that the followers of Islam make up about 1/4 of the earth's population at this time. By virtue of population alone, one could say that Islam has power over a quarter of the earth at this time, which happens to be in that period of time called the latter days, by the way. Just a note here that if you want to know more about how we know that we are living in the latter days, and have been since the 1840s, go to my YouTube channel titled Integral Destiny 9. You can see that channel in the bottom right of the slide. Then find and watch my video titled The Prophecy of the Seventh Millennium. Next, an explanation of the dreadful phrase about this unnatural pale green horse and rider being given the power to kill by the sword, famine, plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Critics of Islam often point to the historical fact that the territory of the Islamic Empire grew exponentially by armed force. This spread of the faith by the sword did occur, but through force was not the only way Islam was spread. Many people willingly converted. The little known historical fact here to illustrate this: the Mongols invaded many areas under Islamic rule starting in the year 1258 Common Era. Their invasion actually wiped out the Abbasid Islamic Empire, and through the next 100 years many of the Mongols converted to Islam, obviously not through force since they were the ones in control. This map shows the early spread of Islam. The dark green area in the Arabian Peninsula shows how far Islam had spread by the time of the death of Muhammad. Not very far. The light green area is how far it was spread by the end of the first caliph's reign, that was Abu Bakr. The pink shaded areas of the now Islamic Empire were added in the times of some subsequent caliphs. Remember that these caliphs were not who Muhammad wanted to be the leaders of Islam. So this spread of the faith of Islam was achieved mostly by the pale horse and rider of the corrupted leadership of Islam. Another way to view the sword is the same as we reviewed in the white horse and rider section. The sword is the Word of God. Thus, this sword can also symbolize the Word of God that was spread by the expanding of the Islamic Empire. Note that we have confirmation by the Messiah of the latter days, Baha'u'llah, that when this corruption of the leadership of Islam occurred, there was no corruption of the text of the Quran itself. However, some of the sayings of Muhammad which were written down, mostly by some literate people who were within hearing range of Muhammad's teaching, referred to as the Hadith, some of these sayings were forged by some of these corrupt leaders. Not all, but some Hadith were forged, saying things that were not true yet were attributed to Muhammad. Note that when I say that the text of the Quran was not changed, there are a few erroneous interpretations of the content of the Quran that are incorrect. One such error is understanding on the topic of the seal of the prophets. Muhammad stated that he was the seal of the prophets. Most Muslims have been educated to understand this as literally so, that there would be no further prophets after Muhammad. Yet the Quran speaks of the great announcement and other terms that strongly indicate a prophet to come in Muhammad's future. So or I should say the future after Muhammad. So the true meaning of the seal of the prophets does not mean what is commonly thought. But I cannot get into a big discussion of that now. Just shorten it by saying that it was only the station of the minor prophets, that the Nabi, that would no longer be sent to humanity. But the major prophets, the Rasul, or manifestations of God, would continue. So no more Isaiahs, Daniels, Jeremiah, and such, but prophets similar to Muhammad, Jesus, Moses, etc. would continue. So the question is, did this corrupted Islam bring famine and plague as Revelation foretold? The answer is yes, but in a symbolic way, a much more spiritually relevant symbolism than a literal understanding of those terms, famine and plague. Jesus and all the other prophets or manifestations of God are sent to us by God to teach us spiritual concepts that increase our development and accumulation of spiritual attributes, often referred to by the biblical code word of wealth. Our wealth is our accumulation of these good virtues such as kindness, perseverance, trustworthiness, mercy, etc. And these divine luminaries, the divine physicians, give their prescriptions for us to elevate the health of our souls that we might soar in the atmosphere of God's love. Spiritual wealth, then, is the accumulation by the soul of praiseworthy spiritual attributes during one's life while in this physical world. This is the wealth that one takes into the afterlife. Spiritual health is the condition of the soul. Is it robust and capable of feeding on spiritual nutrition, the teachings of the prophets? Or is the soul diseased, stuck in a physical world, dead to the life of the spirit, meaning not spiritually aware and enlightened? Therefore, a lack of spiritual wealth is famine, meaning spiritual starvation. A lack of spiritual health is plague, meaning spiritual disease. And just like some physical diseases, some spiritual diseases are communicable to others. By saying that Hades, translated as hell or the unseen, following close behind this horse and rider means that they would bring spiritual famine and plague. Then we come to the very last phrase referring to this pale green horse and rider, that these undesirable events would be done, quote, by the wild beasts of the earth. The term beast in Bible prophecy means earthly kings and leaders of religion included. The phrase by the wild beasts means that this spiritual famine and plague would be brought by the kings and leaders of this pale green mockery of the pure Islam that Muhammad brought, but was damaged by these beasts that usurped the divinely ordained chain of leadership Muhammad wanted but was not followed. These leaders are wild, and because they do not follow the laws of God, they would be called wild beasts. And note here that if you want more specifics how we know that the Bible prophecy term beasts refer to earthly human kings, rulers, and other leaders of nations, religions, groups, etc., watch my video on chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. Daniel's vision of the 4 beasts that arise out of the churning sea illustrates this. You can see my video that explains this. It's the video called Book of Daniel Part 3 that you can find on my YouTube channel named Integral Destiny 9. That's at the bottom of the slide there. And don't forget the 9 at the end. Integral Destiny 9, all one word. A strong warning here. Do not think that the concerns about these wild beasts of the earth leading the world spiritually astray only refer to the kings and leaders of Islam. Because the longer the world, especially its leaders, refuse to recognize and follow the laws and counsels of God's Messiah for this new era, Baha'u'llah, the more wild and wayward these other beasts, too, will lead their nations, religions, governments, and others astray. Now, 154 years after Baha'u'llah proclaimed his identity in 1863, and 125 years after his 40 years of revelation ended with his death in 1892, the world has careened into the wild, as in wild beasts mentioned in the verse. Religious and world leaders still reject and ignore Baha'u'llah's writings and counsels as those of a false prophet, and his faith, the Baha'i faith, as a mere cult. The book of Revelation in chapter 7, verse 1, and other prophecies from other books of the Bible speak of the four winds or four spirits of heaven that will blow or otherwise have effects on the earth at the time of the latter days. The refusal of world leaders to follow God's new laws will have their effects. As the cliche derived from Hosea chapter 8 verse 7 says, the earth will reap the whirlwind from the failures of leadership, but also the neglect of these new laws by the general populace of all the existing faiths and regions of the world. The book of Revelation and other prophecies from other books of the Bible speak of, these four horses and riders, the four winds of heaven, the four spirits of heaven, that will all blow or have effects on the earth at the time of the latter days. And of course the effects of the pale green sickly Islam, not the pure Islam of Muhammad, will affect the rest of the world as well, as we have all observed in the last many years. All allude to the same processes affecting the world. More about those processes when we discuss the second interpretation of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, circled in red here, and that's which is in the second part of this video, Interpretation B. That is the end of section 1 of this video about Interpretation A of the prophecy of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. This break slide is just to help you to mentally shift as we go into Interpretation B. You can even take a little rest break here if you wish. Just pause the video if you want to. Now we go on to review the second possible interpretation of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Remember that both of these interpretations, in Part A and this Part B, are correct. You should know both of them for a broader-based understanding of the book of Revelation. This second interpretation, B on this slide, interprets these four horses as four forces at work in the world before, during, and for a time after the Messiah returns with his new message from God, appropriate for the latter days, and which would take humanity into the seventh millennium, the Sabbath millennium, when a divine civilization would be constructed on earth, as it is in heaven. Again, note that both of these interpretations are correct. The amazing book of Revelation has many meanings that could all be correct interpretations, as long as they agree upon. We need to review the 8 short verses of the book of Revelation that all this conjecture from which the four horsemen of the apocalypse originate. I'll be reading these 8 verses nonstop, then we'll go back and review the key points in each of these chapter 6 verses 1 through 8. Quote, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, Come! I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, Come. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, Come. I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, Come. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. These are the key characteristics of each of these four horses and riders from those verses. I won't review these key points here, but rather will review each as I talk about each horse and rider as they make their appearances after 4 of the 7 seals on the small scroll are opened. We also need to see how there are some similarities between the book of Revelation and the book of Zechariah. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Another mention of horses in Bible prophecy is the book of Zechariah, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Rather odd that they are both in chapter 6, verses 1 through 8 in both books. Could be coincidence or otherwise. Here is the text from Zechariah on the chariots pulled by horses of similar colors to the Revelation verses. Quote, And again I looked up and saw 4 chariots coming out from between 2 mountains, mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second chariot black horses, the third chariot white horses, and the fourth chariot dappled gray horses. Then I said to the angel who talked with me, What are these, my Lord? The angel answered me, These are the 4 winds of heaven going out after presenting themselves before the Lord of all earth. The chariot with the black horses goes towards the north country, the white ones go toward the west country, and the dappled ones go toward the south country. When the steeds came out, they were impatient to get off and patrol the earth. And he said, Go patrol the earth. So they patrolled the earth. Then he cried out to me, Lo, those who go toward the north country have set my spirit at rest in the north country. For our purposes here, we need to emphasize this phrase from verse 5, quote, These chariots are the 4 winds of heaven going out after presenting themselves before the Lord of all the earth, end quote. Note that these chariots and their horses are equated with the 4 winds of heaven. The winds of heaven are mentioned in many places in the Bible. These verses in Psalms explains best what these winds of heaven mean. From Psalm 104, verses 1 through 4, this quote is truncated a bit for brevity. Verses 1, part of 3 and 4, quote, Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty. You make the clouds your chariot. You ride on the wings of the wind. You make the winds your messengers, fire and flame your ministers. The book of Revelation and other prophecies from some other books of the Bible speak of the 4 winds or spirits of heaven that will blow or otherwise have effects on the earth at the time of the latter days. These 4 winds or 4 spirits are forces that have great effects upon our physical, political, economic, and spiritual conditions. They are also symbolized by the 4 horses and their riders in chapter 6 of Revelation in our second interpretation. These 4 horses and their riders in Revelation are sent by God to send specific forces and their messages to humankind, just like the 4 winds of heaven, to warn them of things that will happen before, during, and even for a time after the appearances of the Lamb and the one who sits on the throne. In other words, before, during, and after the appearances of the Bab, the forerunner, and Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah. These winds of heaven are four forces that will result from the appearances of the Messiah and the forerunner, and the reaction of worldly forces that do not want to recognize him and follow the new laws of God for the new era the Messiah brings. It's also the God-appointed time for the maturation of humanity, a passage into the new era of responsibilities brought to humankind, and many of the adolescents, us, are rebelling against these new laws and their messengers. That leads us to this question. What exactly are the four forces and messages that these four horses and riders are bringing us about the times leading up to, during, and then for a while after the appearances of the Lamb and the one who sits on the throne? These four forces or winds of heaven are power politics, widespread warfare, economic injustice, and malignant materialism. Those are the short answers. I'll provide some details next. We will start with the first horse, the white horse and rider again. These symbolize the forces of power politics that will affect our entire world until the coming of the Messiah and for a period of time afterwards too. Remember the traits or circumstances of this horse and rider. The rider held a bow, but there's no mention of arrows in the bow or his quiver. The rider was given a crown, but apparently not a golden one. And the rider rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. So the first seal on the scroll is broken, and the white horse and rider ride forth as if having a grand purpose, but with an empty bow, meaning full of theologies and ideologies developed by humans that lack divine guidance and authority. That's the missing arrows. The rider having a crown in and of itself signals that worldly power and might are sought and wielded. But the crown not being golden again means that this power is worldly, not divine. That is, this power is lacking divine authority, thus prone to error and poor judgment of those in power. What about that conqueror bent on conquest phrase? Having power often makes the powerful want to use that power to gain more and more and more. Thus, the desire for conquest or control can become like a cancer and affect many peoples, even the whole world. Power seeking by individuals, groups, that's political, religious, ideological, and even business groups, and nations causes reactions by other individuals, groups, and nations. If a nation invades another nation to gain control, the invaded nation, and perhaps even other nations, will most likely react and fight back. Power seeking is a destabilizing negative force that is never constructive. Humanity has been captive to this quest for power since our very beginnings. Conquest for power, as the verse foretells. I won't even try to list all the possible examples of this persistent penchant of many humans to grab, use, and especially abuse power. I think we can all come up with dozens of examples, especially from recent history and current events. Now we move on to the second horse and rider, the red horse with its sword-bearing rider. And here are the key attributes of this red horse and rider. They were given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. And the rider was given a large sword. War, yes, in this interpretation of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the red horse and rider signify worldwide war and the death and destruction that results from it. So this horse and rider racing onto the scene tells us that warfare in the period before, during, and for a short time after the appearance of the new Messiah, war would be prevalent. This is no surprise, is it? The white horse and rider that we discussed already highlighted this worldwide obsession we humans have had through the centuries with gaining, keeping, and expanding our power. That is, the relatively few of us who actually have power of any sort. Obviously, this would lead to war on many occasions. often worldwide. Power seekers, power politics collide and cause wars that kill and maim all the rest of us in the process, and drain our national treasuries to boot. About that large sword the writer was given, with the coming of the new Messiah, Baha'u'llah, born in 1817, technological advances bring new, more powerful weapons onto the scene. These technological advances could be used to help humanity by providing cures for disease, ease the burden on workers, bring better living standards, among other societal improvements, but they can also be used for harmful purposes such as warfare. We humans make the decisions how they are used. Here are some examples of how we humans, since the early 1800s, have made many improvements, so-called, to the tools of warfare, and nations spending increasing amounts of their citizens' money on these weapons to increase the devastation of these wars too. Such things as bigger, more powerful bombs, airplanes and drones to deliver those bombs, missile launchers, armored vehicles to get past the enemy's defenses, repeating rifles invented in the mid-1800s when the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the forerunner and the Messiah, still walked the earth. Then automatic rifles and machine guns, bazookas, grenades, shoulder-mounted missile launchers, etc. to kill more and more and more. Then we also have the addition of biological warfare agents, for example, the smallpox blanket tactic used against Native Americans and others, anthrax and the like, and chemical weapons of mass destruction. Mustard gases, sarin, among many others that attack the skin, lungs, nervous systems, and blood, such as cyanide. And this, the largest sword of all, the nuclear bomb. If we would have put all this effort into waging peace instead, think of where our world could have been by now, as far as social and economic and scientific improvements. This graph shows the increasing numbers of wars through time since the year 1000 Common Era on the far left, and as we go to the 20th century on the right. As mentioned before, the main point of this graph is to illustrate that very close to the time that the Bab and Baha'u'llah appeared on the scene, with their births in 1819 and 1817 respectively, warfare as an indicator of human distress skyrocketed. This data is proof that the red horse and rider have been running rampant through our world, just as foretold in the book of Revelation. Next, what the third horse, the black horse, and its rider symbolize. What sort of force have they been exerting on our world? The key characteristics of the black horse and rider for this interpretation are that the rider is holding a set of scales, also called a balance, and a voice is heard stating 2 pounds of wheat and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages. Do not damage the oil and the wine. The most significant clue about what the black horse and rider symbolize are the scales, the balance that the rider carries. The balance of justice motif has been used for centuries to symbolize how the law must weigh the evidence and the law to deal justice for an accused lawbreaker, the victim, and society as a whole. We need to review that verse from verse 6 from chapter 6 again. Quote, "Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures, saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." Wheat and barley are edible grains, edible by both humans and animals. Wheat is mostly for humans, barley more often used for animal fodder these days. Note that some translations of the Bible of these verses give the quantities as 1 measure of wheat instead of 2 pounds, and 3 measures of barley, and other small variations. But it remains that the day's wages is a very small quantity of grain. Note that the day's wages are the wheat plus the barley. So it would be 8 pounds of grain altogether in this example here. I did a little research and to try to figure out how many loaves of bread one gets from these pounds of wheat and barley. Wheat is in column A, barley is in column B. Now I started out with the premise that they were speaking of giving pounds of raw grains to the workers. So they would have to make flour or meal out of those raw grains. So in row 2 there you see that 2 pounds of wheat equals 8 cups of flour. And in column B, 6 pounds of barley equals about 12 cups of meal or flour. The recipes I saw for making flour vary, of course. It's usually between 2 and 3.5 cups of wheat flour or barley flour that are needed per loaf. So if we have 8 cups of wheat flour, you end up with 2 to 4 loaves of bread. In column B, if we have 12 cups of barley, we get 3 to 6 loaves of bread. So sum total between 5 to 10 loaves of bread per day for the worker, his or her spouse, and children, if any. But we don't actually live by bread alone, not in the material world, that is. The bread of the Spirit, that's prayers and worship of God and good deeds, are sufficient for the soul, but we're speaking here of the material world at this moment. So 10 loaves of bread per day for a day's work may keep body and soul together for a day, but they do not do any of the following. They don't give you all the daily nutritional needs of your body. They don't put an adequate roof over your head or put clothes on your back or educate you, don't cover transportation costs, they don't pay the doctor, dentist, hospital, etc. for health care, they don't pay the electric, phone, gas, and other utility bills, they don't cover maintenance and repair costs, etc., etc., etc. Just think of all the costs of living that you have. And here are some other considerations. When will the worker have time to prepare and bake all this bread? How would the worker be able to afford the fuel to bake the bread? How to afford a home and the appliances with which to bake the bread? How to feed his or her children, among many other questions. What all this means is that the black horse and its rider bring and highlight that there is injustice that is rampant in this time before, during, and for a short time after the new Messiah appears on the scene. Injustice from prejudices of all type, class, race, national origin, etc., that cause people of some groups to suffer unequal opportunities in life, which prevents them from making use of all their ability, causes injustice, and this injustice harms them and harms society as a whole. In particular, this example having to do with the amount of grain being given to each worker per day as at work highlights economic injustice that would be rampant in the world. This is what the day's wage examples are giving us. And we see that all around us now. The leaders of the world appear to not know how to end the injustices, or they lack the will to do so because of the people who hold the reins of power and money do not desire that these injustices be remedied. Note that the power-seeking behavior rampant in our world from the first white horse of power politics accentuates the economic and other types of injustices as a result of those who achieve power making sure most of the rest of us are devoid of any power, which includes being without resources to change our lots in life. Add the red horse and rider, that's warfare, into the mix, and you get extra poverty, meaning economic injustice and other forms of injustice. An unjust world is not sustainable. We know this from a couple millennia of experience with the rise and fall of numerous empires and kingdoms, sometimes through the rebellion of the people at the bottom of the economic ladder. Here's a list of some of the common causes or contributing factors to the descent and fall of civilizations and empires. The causes and contributing factors highlighted in yellow here are very dependent on the effects from economic causes, such as economic downturns, including some that may have come from an over-reliance on slave labor. That is a well-known cause, or at least a contributing factor to the fall of Rome in particular. In line with that, note that a large number of U.S. workers work full-time, but their wages are not sufficient to provide adequate income for one adult, much more their children. Is this not close to slave labor? How can our society maintain a healthy economy when a large segment of our people, our hard-working people, cannot make ends meet at the end of the workday? This is true actually for most of the nations on earth. The working poor are scraping by just barely, while a small segment of society gathers in nearly all the profit from their work. The rider of the black horse announcing that workers are paid 2 pounds of wheat and 6 pounds of barley as a daily wage is pointing out the deleterious force of economic injustice that would permeate our world before, during, and for a short time after the arrival of the Messiah of the latter days, Baha'u'llah. Notice in the artwork how the balances are not balanced. Something is out of whack. There is injustice in the world. The balances are not balanced because, as this example of the day's wages being only a couple bags of grain, are not truly equivalent in worth of all that hard work. Here's some data about how wages in the USA have fared since 1990. Wages have in effect frozen since 1990. We will compare two indicators. Part A, the two rows at the top, the increase in real value of the minimum wage since 1990 has been 21%. That's a 21% increase. However, the increase in the cost of living since 1990 is 67%, more than triple the increase in the minimum wage. In Part B, the bottom two rows, we see that 1 year's earnings at the minimum wage, if working full-time, is $15,080. But the income required for a single worker to have real economic security is twice that amount at $30,000 per year. This chart is from the Economic Policy Institute. See their website at the top. It shows the gap between productivity that has increased dramatically since 1973 and a typical worker's compensation that has remained flat during that period. In that period of time from 1973 to 2015, about 42 years, productivity of American workers increased by 73.4%. However, hourly pay only increased in those 42 years by 11.1%. So productivity has grown 6.6 times more than pay. Note on the chart that before about 1973, productivity and pay increased at an almost identical rate. The average hourly compensation was about 91.3% of productivity before 1973. Now this chart is from the International Labor Organization from a report they titled Global Wage Report 2016-17, subtitled Wage Inequality in the Workplace. The web page can be found just below the title of the chart at the top. The chart is titled Trends in Growth in Average Real Wages and Labor Productivity in Developed Economies. So this is for the world, not just for the USA. This is for a period from 1999 to 2015. This data includes labor data from developed economies from around the world, as mentioned. The top darker line on the graph shows the increase in labor productivity from 1999 through 2015. The wage index line is lighter and obviously below the productivity index chart. The two diverged starting in 1999 and show an increasing gap between the two since 1999. Another way to show this, remember that other balance showing a day's wage versus some bags of grain. The worth of productivity on the left of these scales is much heftier than the worth of the income of the workers who produce that productivity in our symbolic representation here. Obviously a sign of injustice. I found two cartoons that illustrate the power of money and injustice in our world. This first cartoon here is by Nick Anderson. The wealthy person at the top of this heap of cash accuses the powerless person at the bottom with a, as you see on the ground there, just a minimal amount of money, of wealth. The wealthy person is accusing that person of hurting the economy by demanding that the minimum wage be increased. And the second cartoon here, apparently by a person named M. Worker, and it was apparently published in Politico, if I'm reading this correctly. Now, this again is illustrating economic imbalance in the world. It's strange and funny how a cartoon can really put a special perspective forward of this economic injustice. We can really recognize the unsustainability of current affairs from this simple cartoon too. And the imbalance of the scales is quite apparent. Note the remarks in the upper left that the top 1% control 46% of the world's wealth. That's a statistic by the organization called Oxfam, which monitors economic and social justice issues in the world and publishes their findings periodically. You can find their website at www.oxfam.com. It's up in the upper left also. So we see that this prophecy of a future of unjust low wages, economic injustice, has come true. Now, at last, the fourth horse and rider appear on the scene. The forces of heaven that sent the white, red, and black horses of power politics, war, and economic injustice compounds the world of problems by adding the pale, sickly green horse and rider to the mix. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, you should be aware that newer translations of the Bible, many of those translators are now saying that it's not just a pale horse, but a pale green horse that appears. And its key characteristics are the rider is named Death, with Hades, hell in some translations, the unseen in some others, following close thereafter. This horse and rider were given power over a quarter of the earth to kill by the sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. This is the pale green horse of spiritual decay, corruption of religions, and malignant materialism. The rider being death means that death results from these three eddies swirling in the forces the fourth horse brings. However, the use of the term and symbol of death is not about death in the physical world, but rather spiritual death and lifelessness. Death is also symbolic of the absence of divine authority and the absence of divine protections and guidance that a connection to the divine can provide. Next, this yellow highlighted verse. This horse and rider were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by the sword, famine, and plague. The meaning of 1/4 of the earth is rather clear, but what does by the sword mean? Wasn't warfare already covered by the red horse and rider, after all? This sword is the two-edged sword of religion. One side of the sword is the true words and spirit of the revelations brought by God's prophets, Abraham, Moses, Krishna, Buddha, Zoroaster, Jesus, Muhammad, and of course the Bab and Baha'u'llah. The other edge of the sword is the corrupted versions or interpretations of the Word of God. And in this second interpretation, it is not just the corruption in Islam that we discussed in part 1, but rather in all the existing faiths as they have been changed, used, and abused by humans through the centuries for worldly gain. The killing of a quarter of the earth by famine and plague are symbolic terms, symbolic of spiritual death, famine, and plague. So we need to talk about spiritual wealth and spiritual health. Jesus and all the other prophets or manifestations of God are sent to us by God to teach us spiritual concepts that increase our development and accumulation of spiritual attributes, often referred to by biblical code of the word wealth. And these divine luminaries or manifestations of God give their prescriptions for us to elevate the health of our souls, that we might soar in the atmosphere of God's love. Spiritual wealth is the accumulation by the soul of praiseworthy spiritual attributes during one's life while in this physical world. This is the wealth that one takes into the afterlife. Spiritual health is the condition of the soul. Is it robust and capable of feeding on spiritual nutrition, the teachings of the prophets? Or is the soul diseased, stuck in a physical world dead to the life of the spirit, meaning not spiritually aware and enlightened? To restate this more simply, and to make sure the point is gotten across, a lack of spiritual wealth results in famine, meaning spiritual starvation of the souls of humanity. A lack of spiritual health results in plague, meaning spiritual disease that is communicable throughout society. This famine and plague cause spiritual decay, corruption of religions, and the growth of a materialistic view of life to a degree that it becomes malignant materialism. These conditions result in about 1/4 of the world's population to suffer from some degree of these spiritual ailments and even spiritual death. Some of the signs of spiritual decay in our world around us include less concern by individuals about their own private expression of love for God and self-directed obedience to God's laws. Many people now are not at all concerned about the spiritual or mystical side of life. Concern about it just never crosses their minds. They are totally attached to the physical world. It's also noticeable that there is a withdrawal from existing organized faiths by increasing numbers of people in the last century, and increasingly so lately. And along with that, a rise in atheism. With this reduction in spiritual identity, there's been growing greed, disobedience to civil laws too, sexual permissiveness, among other results from this remoteness from God's love and His covenant. One of the chief ingredients in the corruption of religion is from their involvement in power politics. Many religious groups and clergy have become deeply involved in power politics, and increasingly so in the last 60 years. The results are that religious organizations, including clergy at all levels, become involved in power plays, gaining money for personal use, partisan politics, lobbying politically for civil actions to force their own religious belief on others, among similar worldly endeavors that are corrupting. This corruption of religion is self-corrupting, meaning it doesn't come from outside. No one's forcing it on these religions. For example, the clergy in Hitler's Germany decided to conform to Hitler's views, such as towards Jews, to some extent to curry favor with the regime. Those who did not go along with it would be subjected to imprisonment, even physical death, of course. Those who cooperated with mistreatment of others or who turned a blind eye to it were not obeying their own religious beliefs and thus were corrupted or leaving themselves open to corruption. The third result of the spiritual famine and plague that the pale horse and rider bring is the rise in materialism. It arises from the process of the corruption of the individual and the corruption of religions and spiritual decay in general. They feed each other to a point where it becomes malignant to the spiritual condition of individuals, societies, nations, and the world at large, like this black hole of malignant materialism draws in the corruption of religion, individuals, and the spiritual decay to feed its energy. Materialism is a tendency to consider material possessions and physical comfort as more important than spiritual values. In philosophy, it's the doctrine that nothing exists except matter and its movements and modifications. Now, if we look at the term malignant and try to define it through its synonyms, we can get malicious, malevolent, mean, nasty, cruel, unkind, evil-intentioned. And regarding disease, malignant means virulent, invasive, fatal, dangerous, and uncontrolled, among others. As mentioned, the three things that result from the spiritual famine and plague brought by the pale green horse and rider feed each other. They're intertwined and they feed each other. The more corruption of religion, the more materialism. The more spiritual decay, the more corruption in religion, etc., etc. To be clear, by saying that Hades, that's translated as hell, following close behind this pale green horse and rider means that they would bring spiritual famine and plague to earth, hell on earth. Hades means hell, but Hades can also mean the unseen. Hades is symbolic of the absence of divine authority, protections, and direction. Hell following spiritual death means that these souls who fall victim to this spiritual famine and plague are remote from God in either this material world or in the spiritual world, possibly in both. This is a quote from a small book written by Baha'u'llah, the new Messiah for this age, called Hidden Words. Quote, "O Son of Being, love me, that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. Know this, O servant." End quote. Baha'u'llah is speaking for God here as his manifestation of God on earth. He is saying that by not loving, following, and obeying God's word, we will be remote from God. And just like our being further away from the campfire at night will assure our being denied the benefit of the heat and the light from it, being remote from God, meaning not recognizing his sovereignty and obeying him, will assure us that we will not be able to benefit from God's love. It's our problem, not his. We must make the effort to get in closer to God. So, the spiritually remote from God will fall victim to the spiritual famine and plague. Then we come to the very last phrase referring to this pale green horse and rider, that these undesirable events would be contributed to, quote, by the wild beasts of the earth, end quote. The term beast in Bible prophecy means earthly kings and leaders, which could be kings and leaders, could be elected leaders, could also include leaders of religions, leaders of, in our world, leaders of large corporations. Now, it was explained in part 1 also. The phrase "by the wild beasts of the earth" means that this spiritual famine and plague would be partially caused, aided, and abetted by many corrupt kings, queens, religious leaders, etc. These leaders are wild because they do not follow the laws of God, thus will be remote from God and lack divine guidance in their decision-making. These corrupt leaders will exacerbate the problems and be unable to stop the spiritual decay, corruption of religion, and malignant materialism, which were mentioned as resulting from the spiritual famine and plague. This is our world under the effects of these four powerful and swirling forces, the four horses of the apocalypse. These forces are overwhelming. You can barely see the earth underneath all these swirling forces. Now, with all these forces upon us, it has made us feel as if our world is wobbling on its axis, careening out of control amidst swirls of power politics, warfare and violence, economic instability and injustice, and the results of the spiritual famine and plague, that is, malignant materialism, corruption of religions, and spiritual decay. But never fear, the Messiah is coming. He'll magically save us from these four horsemen and their relentless riders. Or will he? Yes, he will save us, but... Remember this quote from Baha'u'llah? Note that he is speaking for God here. Quote, O Son of Being, love me, that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. Know this, O servant. End quote. We must begin by loving God and Baha'u'llah as his manifestation for this new era. Then, because we love God, we must obey the laws God sent to us through Baha'u'llah. Then, as Baha'u'llah stated, once we love God and Baha'u'llah, there, God's and his manifestations, love can reach us and help us find solutions to our problems, both spiritual and material. Here are some of the basic teachings and laws from God that Baha'u'llah brought to us for the new era. First, there's only one God, and there's only one religion of God which has been revealed progressively from God's manifestations that he sent us. And they've included Moses, Krishna, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, the Bab, and Baha'u'llah, and others to come in the future. The oneness of humankind, we are all members of one race, the human race. The equality of women and men. The independent investigation of truth. We are responsible for our own spiritual advancement and must not blindly follow traditions, movements, and the opinions of others. In line with this teaching, the Baha'i faith does not have a clergy. The elimination of prejudice. Prejudice results in much suffering, wars, destruction, enmity, and is most often based on misinformation or even disinformation. Sixth, the unity of science and religion. Baha'u'llah teaches that they must agree. Science without religion can become a monster, and religion without science becomes mere superstition. Seventh, economic justice. The extremes of poverty and wealth should be abolished. Cooperation must replace competition as the basis of organized economic activity. Baha'u'llah accepts the need for private ownership of property and the need for private economic initiative. He also calls for establishment of a minimum income level that meets basic human needs. Also calls for progressive taxation to fund the building and maintenance of an ever-advancing civilization. However, the basic foundation should be spiritual, such as, keeping in mind what would Jesus do, or what would Baha'u'llah do, or what would Buddha do, etc. Eighth, an auxiliary international language must be selected by the nations of the earth. This would foster understanding between nations and peoples. And ninth, Baha'u'llah counseled humanity on how to achieve world peace. Humanity must establish a world parliament whose members must be elected by the people in their respective countries and whose election shall be confirmed by their respective governments, and a supreme tribunal whose judgment will have a binding effect even in such cases where the parties concerned did not voluntarily agree to submit their case to its consideration. And in the words of Baha'u'llah, quote, O concourse of the sovereigns of the world, for thereby will the tempest of discord be stilled amongst you, and your peoples find rest. Should any one among you take up arms against another, rise ye all against him, for this is naught but manifest justice. End quote. Those are a few basic laws and social teachings. There are many others in our sacred and authoritative texts, virtually an ocean of the Word of God to dive into. There are also laws to be followed. The Baha'i faith is not a cult or a club or a mere philosophy. The laws are from God, and each person who independently chooses to be a Baha'i should strive to obey those laws. And, just as promised in the Old Testament of the Bible, the Messiah brought a plan for world peace. Since humanity has so far mostly rejected the new Messiah's message, a lesser peace will be established first by the nations of the earth, not necessarily having any knowledge of Baha'u'llah's teachings. God has shaped events to force the nations of the earth to try to find a political solution to humankind's oldest preoccupation, war. First, a world parliament must be convened, the members elected by the nations of the world. The UN basically serves this function, although its membership so far has not been elected by the respective nations. Agreements must be made that when a rogue nation or group attacks another nation or group, that all nations will join together and defeat the rogue nation or group. There have been some of these collective responses in the past, such as to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attack on New York. This and other events have spurred closer and closer ties and cooperation to combat terrorism and other forms of rogue actions by nations and groups. God is basically shoving us into this lesser peace. Through the years, as rogue nations and groups and their leaders learn they cannot aggress against others and get away with it, a form of political peace will evolve. It will not make all warfare or military actions disappear entirely, however. It will be messy at first, getting nations to agree to the policies, defining parameters, and following through, most importantly. We are already in the early formative years of this lesser peace, whether we recognize it or not. Then we are promised that eventually we will get to the most great peace, as a further step ahead beyond the lesser peace. It will only come about when a fairly large percentage of the world's population willingly, individual by individual, recognize Baha'u'llah as God's latest manifestation and follow his laws or otherwise follow his teachings. This will take far longer to happen because we, Baha'is, do not force others to believe anything or obey our religious laws. Note, one of the main tenets of the Baha'i faith is that individuals have to make their own spiritual investigations and decisions. No one will be forced to say they are a Baha'i or follow our laws. Such a thing would be completely antithetical to our teachings. Ultimately, as the years go by and things improve from humanity beginning to recognize the sovereignty of God and abide by his laws, the promised seventh millennium of peace, the establishment of God's kingdom on earth, will be established by around the year 2240 Common Era. That's about 221 years from now. This video was made in May of 2019. We have a ways to go before this era of peace and tranquility, and the path will not be easy. God will not make this new earth. We must build it, bit by bit. Everybody on earth, no magical block and mortar city coming down out of the sky. By the way, that phrase in Revelation 21 verse 2 about the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, that is symbolic for the new divine revelation that Baha'u'llah, the Messiah of the latter days, would bring for all humankind. It is the new covenant of Baha'u'llah, not a brick and mortar city. It has nothing to do with the old city of Jerusalem, just as New York City has nothing to do with the old York City left behind in England by immigrants to the colonies. Now, there is a great deal of confusion on the part of some people about the role the Baha'i faith would play in this Parliament of Nations that I'm saying should be, Baha'u'llah says, needs to be established. Rest assured that the Baha'i faith will not rule the governments of the world in any way, shape, or form. The nations of the world will and maintain their worldly sovereignty, but they will have to give up some of that sovereignty to the World Parliament of Nations in order to establish world peace. For example, nations would have to give up invading other nations as part of agreements within this secular World Parliament of Nations. And this is not the new world order of the Antichrist that many Bible prophecy buffs imagine. Their imaginings are unfounded if they try to misconstrue that Baha'u'llah's teachings have anything to do with such a thing. The Baha'i faith is not concerned with earthly, worldly power-mongering. Rest assured that God has not forgotten us, that there is a way out of the mess we are currently in. But humanity must work together, all nationalities, ethnicities, colors, religions, and economic strata, to achieve peace. The Universal House of Justice, the supreme governing body of the Baha'is of the world, published a World Peace Statement in 1985. It was widely distributed to all the governments of all nations on earth at the time. This peace statement outlines steps that must be taken to achieve world peace. If you're interested in reading it, it is available for free online at this address. You'll have to pause the video to write it down. It's referred to with the title October 1985 to the Peoples of the World. For more information about the Baha'i Faith, these two websites are designed for people who are seeking information about the Baha'i Faith, its main figures, history, teachings, and the sacred and authoritative texts of the Baha'i Faith. The top one, Baha'i.org, is the international website. It also has a link in it to the authoritative and sacred texts, which are accessible for free. Then the bottom one, Baha'i.us, is the official website for the USA for seekers about the USA Baha'i community. You can also contact the USA Baha'i community through this website. And again, I want to remind you of this documentary about the life of the Bab, the forerunner to Baha'u'llah. It's available through Amazon.com. You can rent it electronic rental or purchase it electronically, or you can buy a DVD should you wish to do so. Then there's this professionally produced 30-minute video on the life of Baha'u'llah and the start of the Baha'i Faith. Its title is The Prisoner of Akka. You'll have to stop the video and write down this long address, or you can go to the channel, YouTube channel mentioned there, Baha'i Vision. You don't need to worry about the accents over the letters, by the way. Enter that name, Baha'i Vision, into the search box on YouTube. And once you get to that channel, you look for that Prisoner of Akka video. Or you could even enter the name of the video into the search box on YouTube, and that might get you to it. It's about 30 minutes long. And this book, titled Baha'u'llah and the New Era, An Introduction to the Baha'i Faith, is a very readable book that gives an overview of the Baha'i Faith, its four main figures, its history, beliefs, and the faith community of the followers of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. It's not at all preachy, if you're worried about that. It's by J.E. Esselmont, as you see there, and the international book number is given to help you find it. It may be available in your public library. It is definitely available through bookstores and online booksellers like Amazon.com. To access our authoritative and sacred texts, you can go to this website, www.bahai.org/library. When you see the beautiful building there, you can just scroll down until you see this list of authoritative writings and guidance. And you can select any of those. There are links to all of the writings of the people that you see listed there. Baha'u'llah, the Bab, and some others. And then below that, that's our authoritative and sacred texts in there. Other Baha'i literature is below that, and then you can scroll down for even more. It's all free access, by the way. Some of my other videos on my channel, Integral Destiny 9, are shown here. Please watch them, and there are others. Again, go to my channel, Integral Destiny 9. Then there's the video, Every Eye Will See Him, in which I explain that the Bible tells us not to take this prophecy of the coming of the Messiah, coming down from the sky on a literal cloud, not to take that literally. But the Messiah, Baha'u'llah, did indeed come in clouds from heaven, just as the Bible prophecies predicted. The video titled The Prophecy of the Seventh Millennium is about the coming of the Messiah of the latter days based on Jewish mystical writings and the Torah. Then there's the 8-part explanation of the book of Daniel's many prophecies of the coming of the Messiah and the end times. Another video, The Golden Rule, It's the Law, explains how the famous Golden Rule is not just a rule, but it's actually a spiritual law of God and is found in all the major religions. Thank you for watching. Please note that this production is not an official production of the Baha'i Faith community. It was written, produced, and narrated by me alone. Contact me at that email address if you have any questions. All copyright protections are claimed. Do not change any information, slide, diagram, or narration without my permission. And please do not charge a fee to anyone for viewing this video or any part of it. I do not make any money from these videos. I consider this a service and a gift to my fellow human beings.